GW Integrative Medicine, the podcast about disease prevention and health promotion from the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences.
And I'm Dr. Mikhail Kogan, Associate Program Director of the GW Department of Medicine Integrative Geriatric Fellowship, Director of the Integrative Medicine Track Program at GW School of Medicine and Health Sciences, and Medical Director of the GW Center for Integrative Medicine.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez, Administrative Director of the GW Office of Integrative Medicine and Health. Today's guest is Dr. Donald Abrams, one of the world's leading clinical researchers on medical cannabis. An integrative oncologist and professor of clinical medicine at the University of California, San Francisco Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, Dr. Abrams has conducted a number of studies on medical cannabis that were sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and other private and federal agencies.
Dr. Abrams is also a member of the committee that authored the 2017 National Academy of Science report titled The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, the Current State of Evidence and Recommendations for Research. The report is one of the most comprehensive studies of research on the health effects of recreational and therapeutic cannabis use. It offers a rigorous review of scientific research published since 1999 about the health impacts of cannabis and cannabis-derived products, ranging from therapeutic effects to risks of certain cancers, diseases, mental health disorders, and injuries. Donald, you've been my utmost mentor for a number of years, and I'm so excited to have this short conversation with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, yeah.
And, so let's start with, you've been on the research forefront of this field for many years. And before we go to the 2017 National Academy of Science report, what's your recent current research projects and what excites you the most about your own research in the field?
In the field, we're talking about cannabis, I presume. And the last study that I did, we're in the process of analyzing at this point in time. This was a study looking at the addition of vaporized cannabis to the analgesics that patients with sickle cell disease were taking for their acute and chronic pain. And for me, the exciting thing about this study was that it's the first time that anybody has actually studied a cannabis blend that was both THC and CBD, or cannabidiol. Most of the work has been done with NIDA cannabis from the National Institute on Drug Abuse that is purely delta-9 THC, the main psychoactive component. But as you know, cannabidiol, or CBD, has gotten a lot of press as being non-psychoactive, analgesic, and anti-inflammatory. So our study in 23 patients with sickle cell assigned them to inhale vaporized CBD THC cannabis for 5 days in our clinical research center, or to inhale placebo for 5 days. And each patient experienced both. So we're in the process of analyzing that at this point in time. I have no results to report, but it was an exciting study.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, for me as a geriatrician, I have a lot of people in their 80s and 90s, and so using products that has mostly CBD that are much less or not psychoactive is very advantageous, especially if we can show a very specific, concrete research-supported evidence. So, the report, I went through the report several times. It's definitely a super comprehensive, and I don't expect any of our listeners to go ahead and read the whole thing. It's long. But, I find it pretty shocking that the certain grades of recommendations, like for chronic pain, and I'm sure you're going to tell us in shortly more details, but I find that the certain recommendations are really strong. I mean, for chronic pains and for nausea, there were pretty much a very uniform, strong recommendation. So can you elaborate? I mean, if we saying that the cannabis has a strong evidence, but we still have it as a Schedule 1 controlled substance, how do we talk about it?
Well, that's a great point. So, the work that the committee did over 6 months was to analyze about 10,000 published abstracts in the medical literature on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. And I think that's important to point out because most of the positive health effects for therapeutic benefit have come from studying the pharmaceutically approved compounds dronabinol and nabilone. Very little research to date has actually looked at inhaled cannabis as a therapeutic agent. And that's largely because of the fact that the only legal source of cannabis for doing research in this country is NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And NIDA has a congressional mandate that they can only study substances of abuse as substances of abuse. So whereas hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent looking at the potential harmful effects of people who use cannabis recreationally, very few studies are out there which look at the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis inhaled for medical purposes. So what we did was look at those small number of studies, and again, many of them were looking at the pharmaceutical products as opposed to the plant. And we graded the evidence, the strength of the evidence, conclusive, substantial, moderate, limited, or no evidence. And we did find, as you say, that there was conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective for the treatment of chronic pain as antiemetics and for improving patient-reported spasticity and multiple sclerosis. Again, for most of these studies, the benefits were found for the pharmaceutical products, dronabinol or nabilone. Interesting to note that the process that we use, meta-analysis or systematic reviews, has also subsequently been used by a report put out by Veterans Administration's investigators who looked at pretty much the same pain papers that we did and came up with a much less conclusive and substantial enthusiasm for cannabis as a pain medicine. So that's one of the issues here, that, you know, even though we're all doing the same analyses of the same papers, different people, I guess, must inject unconscious biases because we were all supposed to enter these processes with open minds and leave our biases at the door.
Yeah, just for our listeners, I think it's important to know that the national VA system does not allow for any provider inside a VA to recommend cannabis. And it's unclear if that will change anytime soon unless we change the schedule of the cannabis from Schedule 1 to another level or deschedule it completely.
Right, but
So,
your point though, Misha, about why is it still Schedule 1 when the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine claims that it has medicinal use? Because the definition of Schedule 1 is no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. And even in 1999, the last time the Institute of Medicine did an analysis, marijuana as medicine, they also concluded that cannabis had medicinal benefit. And in fact, going way back to 1942, when cannabis was removed from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the LaGuardia Commission very shortly thereafter came to the same conclusion, that it was medicinal and it should be available for patients. But unfortunately, this decision is made by the Department of Justice and not by anyone who has any medical knowledge or information.
yep, sounds like a continuation of separation of politics and science in our current political environment. We'll move on that note. So, you know, as a prescriber, since I've been using cannabis since the beginning of the program in DC, I definitely find that most of my patients, and forget the efficacy research for a second, really prefer a plant-based products rather than prescription cannabinoids. And, you know, I'm not even talking about the cost of prescription cannabinoids. Some of them could be very expensive if insurance doesn't cover. We're talking about thousands of dollars. But if insurance does cover, it's still quite often that patients tend to prefer plant products, mostly because they're either more efficacious or they give lesser side effects, or that they have a more control over the dosing.
Right.
You know, and I often find myself kind of discussing it with them, with realizing quickly that they're really interested more in a plant-based. And then when you forced in the conversations like this with your own patients, how do you navigate this? Do you give them a choice? Do you simply say, well, like, do you give them your own opinion, or how do you handle that?
I actually have not prescribed dronabinol since, I would say, 1992. So, I mean, I'm in San Francisco, California, and we approved medicinal cannabis in 1996. So, for 22 years now, I've been recommending that patients use cannabis. You said prescribe. We cannot actually, as you know, prescribe cannabis. Right. We can only recommend it. So, I, very rarely would I think to suggest just the single isolated molecule of delta-9 THC. Cannabis is what led me to pursue my fellowship in integrative medicine. And during my training to learn about integrative medicine, I was very attractive to traditional Chinese medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine has been using whole plants in concoctions as medicine for thousands of years, and they believe that the whole plant and all the chemicals present in the plant provide the yin and yang, if you will, to balance out the negative effects of the single most psychoactive component and augment some of the beneficial effects. So when you take delta-9 THC out of the background supportive stroma of the 400 other compounds in the plant, it's a different medicine than when you get it in the plant. So that's been my preference, to recommend that patients consume the plant product. Now, how they consume it, do they eat it, do they inhale it, is it THC, is it CBD, is it some magic ratio of the two? That's sort of individually dependent on patient preference, I think.
It's so interesting that, I've started using both cannabis and medications, the dronabinol, a lot later than you, but I very quickly came to almost exactly the same conclusion, even way before I met you. And what's interesting is that, my first year of practice, I think I told you this story, I had a patient who almost died from side effects of Marinol. It was a very elderly man, and he was in the hospital, and he basically developed an acute delirium or change in mental status. And it took us quite a couple hours to figure out what was going on, and thank God we did figure it out. But since, and we don't really see this type of problems with the use of cannabis, so I think, just to kind of reinforce what you said and also add to that, the pharmaceuticals, when we isolate them, seem to not, maybe they increase efficacy, that's possible, but they also seem to increase risk of side effects.
Right.
Substantially.
Yeah.
So, so we have an interesting situation here. So you have foremost expert who contributed to this major scientific data saying, yes, we did this analysis and it looks like the prescription cannabinoids are effective, but we really have not enough data for the actual plant-based. And yet we're also saying at the same time that we believe that the plant extracts appears to be more efficacious and safer. So how do we go forward? I mean, you're doing all this research to the extent that you do. I've tried to do some small projects. We're all trying, and it seems like we're poking along rather slow. So give us some sense as to what do you think going forward, the sort of a major research attempts that should be made either through the political ways or through other means, private sector? What do you think?
So we ended our report from the National Academies by making some recommendations, 4 recommendations, and basically they were all directed at just what you're talking about. What do we need to do? And we said we need to address the research gaps to develop a comprehensive evidence base on the short and long-term health effects of cannabis use, both beneficial and harmful. We need to improve research quality, and we need to improve surveillance capacity. That is, so we can figure out how much cannabis use there is and how much cannabis use there isn't. And then, basically we want the government to take some responsibility for establishing some guidelines to figure out how to best investigate cannabis. Now, the more I do this, I've been doing this now for 21 years, it sort of becomes like more daunting because I was called to South Africa to be an expert witness in a case to make cannabis available as a medicine for the people of South Africa. And in fact, the other side stalled for the 4 days that I was there, and they didn't allow me to take the witness stand.
Wow.
But while I was there, I was able to read the testimony of the expert witness for the other side, who claimed that cannabis is not a medicine because it hasn't been studied in phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials or subjected to phase 4 surveillance, and that it's not standardized. And, all of those concerns and complaints are actually true. So I think what the problem is, we're trying to pharmaceuticalize, if I can make up that word, a botanical remedy. Maybe it isn't a medicine. Maybe it is a botanical therapy, and we're probably not going to be able to study the hundreds of thousands of species of the plant with their varying concentrations of THC and CBD in phase 1, 2, 3, clinical trials. So how do we gather information? I think we always say in oncology that the plural of anecdote is not evidence, and we don't accept anecdotal information. But I will tell you, over my 35 years of being a practicing oncologist, that cannabis is very useful for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, although there are no clinical trials out there that confirm my impression. But it just is, and again, the plural of anecdote is not evidence, so I really should slap myself for saying that, but that's the truth. But what we're trying to do right now, I'm a member of a practice-based research network in integrative medicine, and 3 of our sites in San Francisco, San Diego, and Chicago are launching a pilot study to try to collect information from patients in our clinics and patients in 3 corresponding local dispensaries from people that are using CBD-dominant strains of cannabis to find out, number 1, what they're using, number 2, how they're using it, and number 3, does it work, and for what? And we're doing that, we're not prescribing it. We're not doing a placebo-controlled trial. We're doing a one-time red cap-based, survey, so that the data that the patients put in from their own home, computer will be analyzed in aggregate anonymously, and we'll see if we can learn something about CBD, which is catapulted to the level of miracle drug without any evidence whatsoever in the literature supporting that.
Right. What do you draw from the Israeli experience? Because the Israel nation, as a whole nation, has set up the medical cannabis use quite a while ago. My understanding is that their use is very different. There's a lot of specific restrictions, and they have very little extracts. Most of their products are whole flower, but they have done a lot of research, especially in the area of just looking at the palliation of certain symptoms, including in oncology and in other spheres. So, if the whole country figured out how to do research on the more centralized platform, what can we draw from their experience, you think?
Well, I think I still haven't been there myself to see. Every time they invite me to come to a meeting, I say, you know what? I'm too old to fly in coach from San Francisco to Tel Aviv, and that seems to end the conversation. But I think I might be going in October for a visit, and hopefully I'll see a little bit more firsthand as to what's going on. But, they get a lot of credit, and there have been some publications coming out that I think are pretty impressive. But again, they're observational, which is what I just said we need to do. I mean, their ability to do randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials is I don't think any better than anybody else's. Particularly there was a investigator at the Hadassah University that had in clinicaltrials.gov a listing for a study that he wanted to do looking at cannabidiol in patients with recurrent cancers, and he wanted a target sample size of 60. And, after the trial was said to have completed, there was no information on it. So I sent him an email, and he told me that he only enrolled 4 patients, 3 with glioblastoma multiforme and 1 with another recurrent malignancy. And it didn't work for any of them, and he couldn't enroll patients, so he just terminated the study. So again, I think they're doing, because they have this system where all the patients get licenses and they're asked to complete surveys, I think they do have the opportunity to provide us with some useful observational data. As you said, in cancer patients, at the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicine conference that was held in Germany, in Cologne last October, the Israelis had 3 of the plenary sessions, one on cancer, one on geriatrics, which you would be interested in, and one on inflammatory bowel disease. And again, these are largely observational. I believe the inflammatory bowel disease might have been a prospective interventional trial. But yeah, I think they're doing good work, but we need more good work either from them or from other people as well.
So this was wonderful. So let's try to switch a little bit towards more clinical, because I'm thinking that some of our listeners could be patients, or they just could have a more practical clinical questions. So my first question, there's this myriad of different strains and different ways to administer it, and it almost looks like in multiple consultations that I do, a lot of the patients will often call back, say, you know what, I think I'm even more confused now than I was before I came to see you. And so I'd say, oops, I'm so sorry. So let's talk more. But the problem here appears to be that there's a total lack of nomenclature of strains. And it's when we prescribe medications, it's pretty straightforward. We give a strength, we give the frequency. Here, forget the fact that in DC, I'm not even allowed to tell the patients exactly what strain to get, because that's how they set up the legal system. But, just even in general, it seems to be with lack of a single kind of language around this. How do we guide our patients to the best possible treatment for them?
That's the $64,000 question. And I don't have an answer for that. What I do is I tell my patients, go to the dispensary and tell them what you have and what we're trying to treat. And they're the people truly on the front lines. And they deal with other patients who have similar concerns and complaints. And they know better, number one, what they have in that dispensary, and number 2, what might work. Now, I'm a consultant to a group in Maui, and Maui, they have, before you get to the bud tender, as it was, the person who supplies you with the flowers, they have 3 patient education specialists, 3 women that you can sort of, when you walk in the door, corner one of them and have a conversation with them about what you have and ask them what they would recommend that you purchase. So it's a little bit of a different, where they get their data from, I don't know. I think it's, again, just the personal experience of watching and having, an experience that you and I don't get to have, because, I don't really know what my patients get at the dispensary, and I don't really know how they use it. And, they tell me it works, but it's a black box between, that and my writing them a recommendation letter to go to the dispensary.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the general problem why we have so few physicians who are comfortable in recommending, because, it's really hard for us healthcare professionals to sort of just give up this sense of control and say, go over there and they'll tell you what to do. When we
Right. Yeah.
write the prescription for drugs, we send them straight to the pharmacist and we know exactly what's going to happen. And here it's kind of, as you said, black box. And yet I think we're all doing this, seeing that the patients like it, and they often come back to us and say, this is the best thing that ever happened to me, especially when there's a lot of hard to treat symptoms like nausea and pain. So what's your kind of, if you have a physician who is new to this, who just entering the field and doesn't know how to think about this, what would be your best recommendation to such a person?
Well, again, if they, as far as dosing, we always tell patients start low and go slow, even though it should be go slowly. But, start low, go slow is a better sort of acronym or, slogan. So, tell the patient well, first of all, we have to talk about routes of ingestion. And there's a big difference between inhalation and taking by mouth ingestion, because when you inhale, the peak plasma concentration occurs in 2.5 minutes. And when you take it by mouth, it's 2.5 hours. And when you take it by mouth, the delta-9 THC, the main psychoactive component, goes through the liver and gets metabolized on first pass to an even more psychoactive 11-hydroxy metabolite. So that's why people who are taking edible products or the pharmaceuticals tend to get a little bit more zonked and tend to have a little bit less control over the onset, the depth, and the duration of the effect. Because when you inhale it, the peak plasma concentration occurs in 2.5 minutes instead of 2.5 hours, and then dissipates quite rapidly. And because you're inhaling it, less is going through the liver, and so you have less of that secondary psychoactive metabolite form. Now, a lot of our patients are using tinctures or oils, which they put under their tongue. And we know from the pharmaceutically available sublingual spray, nabiximols, which is available as a medicine in Canada and the European Union, that the pharmacokinetics of sublingual cannabis is probably halfway between inhaled and ingested. So again, the route of administration is different. Do you recommend a patient use THC or CBD? We live in a euphoriophobic society where we think being high is bad for you, and it's not necessarily, especially if you have a terminal illness or cancer. So I'm not sure that this tendency to want to embrace CBD, cannabidiol, because it's not psychoactive is really warranted. But for people that don't want to be high at all, then you would use a CBD dominant product as opposed to THC. Now, the issue is that THC complexes with our so-called cannabinoid receptor, which is highly concentrated in the brain, but also present throughout the rest of the body. CBD actually doesn't complex with the receptor, so it's not an agonist. So how it works is still a little bit mysterious. CBD probably, when taken with THC, decreases some of the psychoactivity. So, patients are seeking all these different ratio products, 2-to-1, 8-to-1, 18-to-1. And, it's a question that I get asked constantly by my patients is, what is the best ratio for nausea, or what's the best ratio for pain? There's no answer to the question. I mean, nobody knows. It hasn't been studied. So I
think we probably need to wrap up soon. So I have kind of a final direction here. So it appears that there are possibility of some new clinical directions with cannabis, and my personal interest, as you of course know, is more into neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There are very small trials suggestive of some possible benefits. We don't really know that for fact, but definitely appears like, especially considering that both conditions really don't have a cure, that this may be something that needs to be researched any further. So that's for me. But for you, what's in terms of the clinical applications? What are the new or just most exciting directions that you see going to be taken in the next decade or so?
Boy, I don't have a crystal ball, and it really depends. I mean, my concern is that as more states allow recreational use, that the dispensaries that are providing medicinal cannabis are going to go a little more lax and not be as conscious and as careful as they are, providing high quality products that we know a little bit about to patients with medical needs. Are people going to jump up and say, "Oh, I want to study cannabis for this condition or that condition"? It's not easy to do, especially while it remains Schedule I, and while there are so many different strains of it, and all of the complications about trying to do research with a plant that is Schedule I. So, I would hope maybe observational data would be increasing as more practice-based research networks, for example, start to try to collect information about what's going on with their patients and their practices who are using cannabis. I do think that there is some potential that we may be able to see people getting off of opiates, or at least decreasing their opiate dosages by using cannabis concomitantly or instead of these much more addictive and dangerous medications that we've so freely prescribed.
So that topic seems to be of a huge importance, since we have such a massive abuse of medications and a very high mortality from not just the illegal heroin, but also from legally prescribed opiates. Well, Donald, it's such a pleasure always talking to you. I hope I'll see you soon, and I think you've contributed so much to this field, and thank you so much for taking time to talk to us and update us on the current state of scientific evidence and research on the health effects of medical cannabis.
My pleasure.
You're listening to the GW Integrative Medicine podcast with GW's Office of Integrative Medicine and Health. For more information, please visit smhs.gwu.edu/OIMH.
And this is Dr. Mikhail Kogan.
And Janet Rodriguez. Thanks for listening.